I froze the moment I saw him across the crowded cafe, my chest tightening as if it had forgotten how to breathe. He looked older, more serious, yet the same quiet boy who had vanished from my life without a word years ago. And I couldn't believe he was standing there, staring at the menu like nothing had changed, while inside I felt every memory of him rushing back like a tide I could not hold back. The way he had smiled at me in the park when we were teenagers, the way his laugh had always made my heart race, the way he had left one day and never explained, leaving only a note that said he needed to find himself, and I remembered crying for hours in my bedroom, my walls covered in the sketches he had drawn of me, and now here he was, closer than I had ever imagined, the sunlight catching in his hair, making it glow like it had back then, and I wanted to run to him, shout his name, tell him I had missed him every single day. But my legs felt frozen, my voice caught in my throat, and the world seemed to shrink until all I could see was him, that same shy, careful way he tilted his head, the same nervous brush of his fingers against his coffee cup, and my mind raced with questions I wasn't ready to ask, yet the pull was irresistible, a force that made me move toward him without thinking, as if my heart had a mind of its own, guiding me through the maze of tables and strangers, until I stopped at the edge of his table, unsure if I should speak or if I would scare him away. And then he looked up, our eyes locking, and I saw recognition, shock, something fragile yet urgent in his gaze, and I swallowed hard, my hands trembling as I lifted them, unsure whether to wave or reach for him, and he whispered my name, my full name, the one only he had ever used, and it hit me like a lightning strike that this was real, that he was really here, that I could finally have answers to the questions that had haunted me for years. And I wanted to ask why he left, why he disappeared, why he had never tried to contact me. But before I could find the words, his phone buzzed, and he glanced down, hesitation crossing his face, a shadow of worry I hadn't seen before, and I realized he wasn't completely free, that maybe something was holding him back, and my heart ached because I wasn't sure if it was me, if I had changed too much, if he had, if the boy I loved was still inside this man, hidden behind that careful expression. And I finally spoke, my voice small but steady, asking if he remembered our last summer together, the summer of the lake, the late nights under the stars, the promises we made without knowing what they really meant. And he smiled, faint and unsure, nodding slowly, and for a moment it felt like nothing had changed, like we were back in that old world where only we existed. But then his gaze flicked past me, and I followed it to see a woman at the door, tall, confident, laughing, someone who seemed familiar. And I realized she was looking at him with the same warmth, the same intimacy I had thought was ours alone, and my stomach twisted, betrayal mixing with the longing I still felt, and I wanted to turn and run, but my feet refused, my body frozen by curiosity and fear, and he looked back at me, his smile faltering, conflicted, as if he had been caught between two worlds, and I felt a pang of panic that I hadn't felt in years, the sudden knowledge that his life had moved on without me, that maybe the boy I had loved was gone, replaced by someone else's life, someone else's laughter, someone else's future, and I took a shaky breath, forcing myself to stay, forcing myself to believe that there might still be a place for me, a moment where we could reconnect, where the past could meet the present, where maybe he still remembered the way I had made him laugh, the way he had made me feel alive, the way we had promised forever, even if we didn't know what forever really meant. And I reached out, my hand brushing against the table, closer to him than I had dared in years. And he looked at it, hesitated, then slowly moved his fingers to touch mine, a spark igniting in that small connection, sending a shiver down my spine, and the world seemed to hold its breath as if waiting for him to choose, waiting for him to decide if he would let me back into his life or if the years apart had built walls too high to climb. And just as our hands met fully, solidly, something fell from the table, a folded piece of paper, landing at my feet, fluttering like it had a message for me. And I bent down to pick it up, my heart hammering, my hands trembling as I opened it to see a familiar handwriting, one I had not seen in years, one I thought I had forgotten, and the words on the paper were simple, yet shocking, a note he had written to me long ago but never delivered, a confession I never knew existed, a truth that could change everything. And I looked up at him, my eyes wide, my breath catching, and he looked back, startled, recognition and guilt mingling in his gaze. And I realized in that moment that nothing would ever be the same, that our story was about to start again, but with secrets, questions, and a chance to rebuild what we had lost. And I felt both fear and hope crash through me as I held the note tightly, realizing that the next moment would decide everything, that his reaction could either open the door to a new beginning or close it forever, and before I could speak, he whispered almost to himself, "I never meant for you to find that." And my heart stopped because in those words lay the tension of years, the weight of everything we had missed, and I knew that whatever happened next, I was no longer the same person who had waited silently for him, that I had changed, grown, and yet this moment was bigger than us both. And as he reached slowly toward the note, a sudden sound came from the door, the cafe door swinging open with a crash, drawing everyone's eyes, and my stomach dropped because the person who entered was someone I had never expected, someone connected to him, someone whose presence promised trouble, secrets, and choices that could destroy everything we were just beginning to touch. And in that heartbeat, I realized that the simple reunion I had imagined was never going to be simple, that the past, the present, and someone else's future had collided all at once, leaving me staring at him, the note trembling in my hands, and knowing with a sinking certainty that nothing would ever feel normal again, and that I had to choose, stay and fight for what we might still have, or walk away before my heart got trapped in a story that could break me completely. That I couldn't move at first, frozen by the sight of him, and then my mind flooded with memories. The first time we met in that small art class back in high school, I had been nervous, tripping over my backpack in front of everyone, and he had laughed softly, the kind of laugh that didn't mock but made you feel lighter, and he had helped me pick up the scattered sketches, his fingers brushing mine just enough to make me feel a spark I didn't understand at the time. And then we had sat together during projects, talking about everything and nothing, sharing our favorite books, our secret dreams, the little fears that no one else seemed to notice. And I remembered how he had shown me the first drawing he had ever made of the park near our homes, the trees swaying, a river cutting through the middle, and I had gasped because he had captured it perfectly, like he could see the world in a way no one else could. And I had laughed when he blushed, hiding behind the sketchbook like it was the most embarrassing thing in the world. And from that moment, we had been inseparable in our small circle, sharing stolen lunches, notes hidden in lockers, walks to the lake after school, secrets whispered under the stars, and I had felt, even back then, that he understood me more than anyone ever had. And then there were the nights we stayed up talking until sunrise, him telling me about places he wanted to see, the music that made his heart race, the people he admired, and me sharing the quiet hopes I rarely said out loud. And I remembered the first time he held my hand, not in a showy way but gently, letting me feel his warmth, and I had squeezed it back shyly, not knowing how much that small touch would change everything. And our laughter had become a language of its own, a secret code that no one else could understand. And I remembered the lake, the water glimmering in the golden light, the two of us sitting on the dock, our legs dangling above the ripples, and he had confessed he wanted to be a part of my life forever, his voice shaking but full of hope. And I had nodded, tears threatening to fall, because I wanted the same. And in those days nothing else mattered, the world seemed smaller and safer when he was near, and I had believed our bond could survive anything, until the day it had shattered, when a letter I never received caused a misunderstanding that neither of us knew how to fix. A letter he had written to tell me he had to move for his family, that he would write and stay in touch, but it had never reached me, and I had waited, weeks turning into months, thinking he had chosen to leave me behind, thinking I had done something wrong, and the pain of that silence had grown heavy, filling every corner of my heart with questions and regrets. And I remembered the day I finally realized he was gone, the empty classroom, the echo of my footsteps in the hallway, the sinking feeling that he was part of a life I would never touch again. And yet, despite that hurt, I had carried him in my memories, every laugh, every secret, every quiet glance that had felt like understanding. And now, seeing him again, older, quieter, the weight of years etched into his face, I could feel all those years collapsing in a single heartbeat. And I saw him glance at me, his eyes reflecting a mixture of recognition, guilt, and something else I couldn't name. And suddenly the past was alive in front of me, as if the years apart had never really happened. And I wanted to reach him, to ask why, to hear the words I had waited for in silence for so long. But before I could, my eyes caught the note that had fallen to the floor, the one I had picked up in the cafe. And I realized the words written there were not what I had expected. They were not a simple apology or explanation, but a memory, a secret from our shared past I had never known existed, a confession he had never had the courage to speak aloud. And as I read the words, the pieces of our separation started to shift in my mind. I understood that the distance, the silence, the months of unanswered questions were not entirely his fault, that fate had intervened in ways I hadn't imagined. And suddenly the anger and hurt I had carried all these years softened into something else, a mixture of longing, relief, and curiosity. and he leaned closer, his voice breaking the quiet, telling me that he had thought of me every single day, that leaving had been the hardest choice of his life, and that he had never stopped hoping that somehow I would forgive him and meet him here again. And I felt tears blur my vision because every memory, every small moment we had shared, suddenly felt urgent and alive, and I realized that the shy boy who had touched my heart was still here, in pieces, waiting for me to help him put them together. And then as I looked up from the note, I saw the woman at the door again, and this time I noticed a resemblance, subtle but undeniable, like a reflection of him in someone else, and my stomach twisted because I wasn't sure if she was a sister, a friend, or something more. And I could see the way he tensed, the way his jaw clenched ever so slightly, as if he had been hiding this part of his life, and I wondered what else he had not told me, what truths were still buried beneath the years. And as I looked back at the note, the words seemed to change, revealing a line I had missed the first time, a hint that our separation had not been a choice at all, that someone else's decision, someone outside of us, had steered our lives apart. And suddenly the story I had told myself for years, the one of abandonment and loss, seemed incomplete, unfair, and I felt a rush of both anger and compassion for him, the boy I had loved, the man I had never stopped thinking about. And I realized that this reunion was not just about confronting old feelings, it was about uncovering truths, understanding why we had been kept apart, and discovering whether the bond we had built in our youth could survive the weight of secrets in time. And as I looked up at him again, his eyes soft, hesitant, full of questions of their own, I knew that the next words he spoke could change everything, could heal or hurt, could open doors we had thought closed forever. And in that moment, the cafe felt both familiar and strange, the hum of conversation fading into the background, leaving just the two of us and the fragile hope of reconnecting. And I held the note tighter, feeling the weight of years, the pull of memory, the possibility of a love reborn. And as he finally reached out, his hand brushing against mine, I noticed a small crease in the corner of the paper, a hidden message that hinted at a secret meeting, a place we had both forgotten. And I realized that what I had thought was a simple reunion was only the beginning, and that the past was not yet done with us, and that the next step could either bind us together or tear everything apart again, leaving me holding both my heart and the truth, unsure of what would come next, yet certain that I could not turn away, because finally, after all these years, the story between us was awake again, and the past had found a way to reach the present. He looked up from the note as I approached, his eyes wide, searching, and for a moment the world seemed to pause, the hum of the cafe fading as I stood there, my heart pounding, my hands gripping the paper as if it held the key to everything we had lost. And he whispered my name again, softer this time, almost like a question, and I felt the years collapse between us, every memory of laughter, whispered secrets, and shared glances flooding back with a force that left me breathless. And I couldn't help but remember the first time we had run through the rain together, our laughter echoing down the empty streets, my hair plastered to my face, his hand in mine, and the feeling that nothing else mattered except being close to him. And now, years later, that same pull was stronger than ever, tugging me toward him even as fear and doubt gnawed at the edges of my mind. And I spoke, my voice trembling, asking him why he had never written, why he had disappeared without a word. And he swallowed hard, eyes dropping to the table, then meeting mine with a mixture of guilt and longing. And he said, "I thought you hated me. I thought you didn't want me in your life anymore." And I felt a rush of anger and relief at the same time, anger at the years of silence and relief at hearing the truth at last. And I couldn't help the tears that formed, blurring my vision as I whispered that I had never stopped hoping, never stopped thinking about him. And he reached out, fingers brushing mine lightly at first, testing, as if afraid I might pull away. And then he gripped my hand more firmly, anchoring me in the present. And for a moment, the past and present collided in a way that was dizzying and beautiful, as if all the years of separation had been leading to this exact touch, this exact moment of connection. And he leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper, telling me about the struggles he had faced, the fear that he would never be enough, the guilt for leaving me. And I listened, heart aching, because every word was a reminder of the bond we had shared, the love that had never truly faded. And I remembered the nights we had stayed up talking until sunrise, the plans we had made, the dreams we had dared to whisper to each other. And I realized that despite everything, despite the silence, the distance, the misunderstandings, we had never truly been apart in our hearts. And then he paused, looking at me with eyes that held questions he had never dared ask, and I felt the weight of unspoken words pressing between us, heavy and urgent. and I spoke first, admitting that I had always wondered what might have happened if he had stayed, if we had chosen differently, and he nodded, his expression softening, confessing that he had wondered the same, that every day had been a struggle without knowing if I was happy, safe, whether I had moved on. And I felt a shiver run through me at the raw honesty, the vulnerability he had never shown before, and I reached across the table, holding both his hands in mine, needing him to feel that I was here, that I had never stopped caring, never stopped loving, and he leaned in closer, so close that I could see the small lines around his eyes, the way his lips parted slightly as if he was about to speak but stopped, and the tension between us was palpable, a mix of longing, fear, and hope that made my heart race. And then I remembered a summer day at the lake, the sunlight dancing on the water, him pulling me into the canoe even though I had protested, and the way he had held me steady as the boat rocked, always careful, always protective, and suddenly I saw that same carefulness in his actions now, the same desire to protect me from hurt, and it made me ache with a longing I had buried for years, and he finally whispered, "I never wanted to hurt you, I only wanted to keep you safe." And I felt the tears spill over as I nodded, whispering that I had known somehow that he had loved me all along, even from a distance, and that I had waited because I had to believe he would come back, that fate would give us another chance, and he smiled, faint but full of emotion, reaching to tuck a strand of hair behind my ear, a small gesture that carried the weight of all the unspoken years, and I realized then that this moment was ours, fragile but real, a chance to start again. But before I could speak, his gaze flicked toward the cafe door, and I followed it, seeing her again, the woman who had entered earlier, someone close to him, perhaps a sister, a friend, or someone I didn't understand yet, and I felt a flicker of fear, wondering if this reunion was more complicated than I had imagined, and he seemed to sense my tension, his hand tightening over mine, murmuring that it was nothing, that she wasn't part of this, and I wanted to believe him, to trust him, but the moment lingered, a reminder that life was never simple, that love was never without obstacles, and then he leaned closer, his forehead brushing mine, and whispered, "I missed you more than I can ever say," and I felt my heart swell with a mixture of relief and yearning, and I knew that despite the years apart, despite the misunderstandings, despite the complications of the present, the connection between us had never truly broken, that it had survived time, distance, and silence stronger than ever, and I wanted to tell him everything, to confess that not a day had passed when I hadn't thought of him, hadn't wished he was there, hadn't dreamed that somehow we might find each other again. But before I could, his phone buzzed again, and he glanced at it, hesitation crossing his face, the same hesitation I had seen earlier, and I realized that even now, there were parts of his life I didn't know, parts that might threaten the fragile bridge we were building, and my chest tightened as I wondered if we were ready to face those truths, if the bond of the past could survive the present. And he looked back at me, eyes full of emotion, asking silently if I was willing to try to step forward with him, and I nodded, letting him see my resolve, and then he smiled softly, a mixture of relief, hope, and fear, and I felt a warmth spread through me as I realized that we had reached the turning point, that this reunion, tentative and fragile as it was, could either heal the wounds of the past or expose them further, and I held his hands tightly, leaning closer, ready to embrace whatever came next, knowing that the next words, the next gesture, the next choice would define everything. And as we sat there, inches apart, hearts racing, the world outside the cafe seemed to blur, leaving only us, our shared history, and the uncertain future that stretched before us, waiting for us to take the first step together. And just as I opened my mouth to speak, he reached into his pocket and pulled out another note, smaller, folded, the edges worn, and his eyes met mine with a vulnerability I had never seen before, whispering, "I thought you should see this," and I felt my breath catch because I knew that whatever was written there could change everything, reveal a truth we had never faced, and in that moment, our reunion teetered on the edge of a choice, between the comfort of what we remembered and the risk of what we had yet to discover, and I realized that love, after all, was always about facing the unknown together, even when it scared you, and I held my breath, waiting for him to unfold the note, knowing that the next moment could either bind us closer than ever or pull us apart again, leaving our story suspended between the past we cherished and the future we had yet to claim. That I held my breath as he unfolded the note, his fingers trembling slightly, and the words written there hit me with the force of everything I had been waiting to understand, a confession I had never imagined, explaining why he had disappeared, why the silence had lasted so long, and I realized in that moment that the heartbreak I had carried for Years was not his fault, that it had been a mistake, a misunderstanding, a misstep that neither of us had caused but that life had forced upon us. And he looked at me, eyes full of vulnerability, saying that he had written that letter years ago, intending to tell me everything, but it had never reached me, and I felt my chest tighten because the anger I had held melted into something more complicated, a mix of relief, longing, and sorrow for all the years we had lost. And he explained that when he left, he had thought I hated him, that I had moved on, and he had been afraid to reach out and find out the truth. And I listened, my hands clutching the note, the paper shaking with my heartbeat, as he told me how every day without me had felt like walking through a fog, wondering if I was thinking of him, remembering him, whether I had forgiven him in my heart even if I had never said the words. And I saw the raw honesty in his eyes, the way his lips quivered as he admitted that he had never stopped loving me, that leaving had been the hardest choice he had ever made. And I felt tears spill down my cheeks, because for years I had blamed him, and now I realized it had never been his fault, that fate had been cruel, that the letter had been lost and the timing had betrayed us. And I whispered that I had waited, that I had hoped, that despite everything I had carried, part of me had never stopped believing we would meet again. And he reached for my hand, holding it tightly, and I felt the warmth, the care, the love that had been buried under years of misunderstanding. And I finally asked him softly why he had never tried to contact me after, why he hadn't found another way. And he looked down, swallowing hard, admitting that he had been afraid I had moved on, afraid I had forgotten, afraid that I wouldn't forgive him even if I had wanted to. And my heart ached because I understood that fear, the same fear that had kept me from seeking him, the same fear that had kept both of us trapped in silence. And then he said, looking into my eyes with all the courage he had gathered over years, that when he had seen me that day at the art exhibit, he had hoped I would notice him, hoped I would reach out. And I realized he had been standing in my world, waiting, watching, and I had not known. And I felt the weight of lost time, the ache of all the moments we had missed, the sunsets, the walks, the quiet laughter, the unspoken words. And yet, sitting there with him holding his hand, feeling the truth finally unfold, I knew that we had a chance, a fragile, delicate chance to rebuild what had been broken, to reclaim what had been stolen by circumstances and miscommunication. And I asked him if he had ever stopped thinking about me, and he smiled faintly, a mixture of sadness and hope, saying never, never for a single day. And I realized that despite everything, our hearts had remained connected, invisible threads tying us together across the years. And then I said, with a trembling voice, that I had carried him with me, every memory, every thought, every hope. And he nodded, and our eyes met, and for a moment the room fell away, leaving just the two of us, the notes, the confessions, and the fragile hope of what could be. And then he leaned closer, whispering that there was something else, something he had never told anyone, a truth about his life during the time we had been apart, something that could explain even more. And I felt my heart skip, knowing that whatever it was, it could change everything again, could test the bond we were trying to rebuild, could either destroy or strengthen the fragile connection that had survived the years. And he paused, looking into my eyes, and I could see the struggle, the hesitation, the fear of revealing too much. And I pressed my hand gently against his chest, telling him I was ready, that I wanted to know that whatever the truth was, we could face it together. And he took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a second, gathering courage. And then he spoke, the words coming slowly, carefully, each one like a stone lifted from his heart, admitting that during the time apart, he had been forced to make choices he had never imagined, had been part of situations that were complicated, involving people he couldn't leave behind, decisions that had shaped his life in ways he hadn't wanted. And I listened, heart pounding, my mind racing to understand, to absorb, to reconcile the image I had of him with the truth he was revealing. And yet, in every word, in every confession, I felt the same love, the same boy I had fallen for, the same honesty. And I realized that life had tested us, challenged us, but it had not erased us. And as he reached the end of his story, a silence fell, heavy but calm, filled with the weight of everything shared and everything left unsaid. And I looked at him, tears streaming, heart full, knowing that forgiveness was possible, love was still there. And yet the final piece hung in the air, a hidden truth he had not fully revealed, a choice he had made that could change everything between us. And I felt the tension tighten, the fragile balance between past pain and future hope. And I whispered that I trusted him, that I wanted to understand fully. And he hesitated, eyes flicking away, then back at me. And I saw the conflict, the love, and the fear all tangled together. And in that moment I realized that the next words, the next revelation, would decide whether we could move forward together or whether the past, the secrets, and the silence would hold us apart forever, and I braced myself, holding his hand tightly, knowing that whatever he said next could change everything, and that our story was on the edge, waiting for one final confession, one final truth to either heal us completely or leave us standing at the crossroads of love and loss, suspended between hope and heartbreak, and I held my breath as he began to speak, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. The moment he finished speaking, the air between us felt lighter, charged with a mixture of relief, wonder, and something I had waited years to feel again, and I realized that the truth he had revealed, the choices, the fears, the years of silence, had not pushed us apart but had led us back together, showing me that our love had survived more than we had imagined, and I reached for his hand, feeling the warmth, the solidity, the connection that had been buried under misunderstanding and time, and he looked at me, eyes wide, unafraid now, and whispered that he had never stopped hoping that we might find each other again, and I smiled, tears spilling freely, because in that moment I knew that every tear, every longing, every memory of him had led me here, and I told him that I had never stopped believing, that I had carried him with me, every thought, every quiet wish, every dream of what we might be, and he nodded, pressing his forehead gently against mine, and the sound of our breathing, steady and in sync, became a rhythm that seemed to erase the years of waiting, the silence and the pain, and I remembered all the moments that had defined our past, the laughter by the lake, the rain-soaked streets, the stolen glances in classrooms, and I realized that love was not about perfect timing or flawless circumstances, but about resilience, trust, and the willingness to hold on even when everything seemed lost, and he pulled me close, his hands cradling my face as he whispered that he wanted to start over, to rebuild everything we had dreamed of, and I felt a shiver of joy, knowing that the walls we had built around our hearts were coming down, brick by brick, leaving only the raw, honest connection that had never really left us, and we stepped outside together, the city glowing in the soft evening light, the sounds of life around us fading into a background hum, and for the first time in years, I felt completely present, grounded in the certainty of us, and he smiled at me, that shy, tender smile that had first captured my heart, and I realized it was still capable of breaking me open in the most beautiful way, and we walked along the quiet streets, talking softly about small things, about dreams, about the simple joys we had missed, and I noticed that every gesture, every glance carried the weight of years, the unspoken understanding that we had been given a second chance, and then he stopped, reaching into his coat pocket, and pulled out a small envelope, worn at the edges, and I recognized the handwriting immediately, the same that had caused so much confusion and longing years ago, and he handed it to me with a nervous laugh, saying that it was meant to reach me before, that it was a promise he had written long ago, and I opened it carefully, unfolding the paper, and inside was a note that read simply that he had loved me then, loved me in the silence, and would continue to love me always, and the words hit me like a gentle tide, washing away the remnants of doubt, fear, and regret, and I realized that love, real love, did not fade with distance, it endured, it waited, it returned, and I looked up at him, eyes brimming with tears and joy, and he smiled back, tender, shy, and utterly himself, and I knew that we were exactly where we were meant to be, together, finally free of the past, and yet even as relief and happiness surged through me, I felt a thrill of awe at the journey we had taken, at the resilience of hearts that refused to give up, and we walked in silence for a while, letting the city fade around us, letting the world exist without demanding our attention, and then he stopped again, this time to pick up a small flower that had grown through a crack in the sidewalk, fragile but determined, and he handed it to me, saying that it reminded him of us, fragile but enduring, and I laughed softly through my tears, knowing that even this simple gesture carried a weight greater than words could express, and I tucked the flower into my coat pocket, feeling it press softly against my heart, a small symbol of love that had survived everything, and we continued walking, hands intertwined, feeling the rhythm of our steps match, our hearts finally synchronized, and I realized that this moment, ordinary in its setting, extraordinary in its significance, was the culmination of everything we had lived, loved, and lost, and in that awareness, I felt a serenity I had never known, the calm after years of storm, the quiet fulfillment of a promise that had waited for the right time, and I whispered to him that we had made it, that we had found each other, that nothing could undo what we had rebuilt, and he smiled, pressing his lips to my forehead in a gesture of tenderness and gratitude, and I felt a warmth spread through me that went beyond love, beyond longing, It was a sense of completion, of destiny fulfilled. And as we stood there in the fading light, I noticed a small envelope tucked under his arm, one he had not yet given me, and when he handed it over, I opened it to find a single line written in his careful hand, saying that even if life tried to separate us again, our hearts would always find their way. And I felt an overwhelming certainty that this was true, that the years apart, the misunderstandings, the fear, had only led us to this moment, to a love stronger than time. And I held the note to my chest, looking at him with a mixture of joy, reverence, and hope, and he reached for my hand once more, squeezing it gently, and I realized that every step we had taken, every tear we had shed, every heartbeat spent in longing had brought us here, to a peace so deep it could only be described as complete. And I whispered that I loved him, and he smiled softly, shy but certain, and said the same. And in that final moment, standing together in the soft glow of evening, holding hands, carrying notes of love through the years, I knew that our story had found its resolution, that love had triumphed over time and silence, and I felt a quiet joy settle in my chest as I looked at him and thought that finally, after everything, we were home together, and that love had never left, it had only waited, and the world seemed to hold its breath around us as we stepped forward into whatever came next, certain that our hearts, intertwined and enduring, would guide us forever.